So I sat down and watched The Learning Curve earlier this week. I guess I really just wanted to escape into that friendly and familiar Voyager world for a minute. And so I was browsing around on Paramount Plus, browsing around for an episode that would be fun and one that I wasn't overly familiar with because I'm overly familiar with most of the Voyager episodes. Something relational, something nostalgic, but not too dark or serious. And then as I was browsing around, Learning Curve popped in my head, though I couldn't remember the title, couldn't even remember what season it was in. So I just kind of kept scrolling to the bottom of all the early seasons because I knew it was at the end. And then finally, I found it there at the bottom of season 1, and I jumped down into it. And there was my good old friend Tuvok, and Chakotay and Janeway, and even good old Chell. Now, there's only one Chell. And I'm not the only one who feels that way. He even made a notable appearance in the PC game Elite Force as a main character. You just can't forget about Chell. I feel like the episode Learning Curve, I feel like it's definitely a relational episode. I think the first real strong indication you get that that's the kind of episode you're going to see is or I think it's one of the first scenes when Tuvok confronts Dalby about changing out the gel pack without permission. And you can definitely passively watch the scene as two people talking, setting something up for a episode of Voyager. But it's fascinating when you look at it instead as a clashing of personalities. You look at it as a bubbling to the surface of all the unseen things inside Dalby's inner world and inside his past experiences. And then where Tuvok, like many Vulcans would be, he's just perplexed, or as Spock would say, fascinated. But no, Tuvok is much more confounded than fascinated. Dalby's kind of like this black box that's giving out the wrong signals. And Tuvok just looks at it and it's like an opaque wall. It makes no sense to him whatsoever. But Tuvok's not really unusual in that way, even though I would say Tuvok seems to me to be a much more idealistically Vulcan character than other Star Trek Vulcans in terms of, mental health, how transparent they are with what emotions they do or don't have, that kind of thing. Tuvok is much more perfect, quote unquote, in that sense. But he still has a lot in common with the real life, unemotional, very logical humans that we've all met. Wonderful people in the real world. And just like so many humans, Tuvok is perplexed because the way he sees it, he treated Dalby the same way he would treat anybody else in that situation. And yet he got this disproportional response, kind of like getting this faulty signal from a black box, from some device that all you can see is the outside, And I'd say that's kind of a theme which continues and goes on throughout the episode. I guess you could say Tuvok's mistake is to think that it is possible to treat all people the same. Kind of like Neelix's inflexible plant stems, Tuvok is kind of limited in that way. He's limited not because he failed to grow and gain knowledge back when he was an academy student, but instead he's limited because back in those days he was sheltered within the academy, along with all the other seekers of excellence. He was sheltered with them, sheltered away from experiencing people like Dalby. It's such an odd thing to think about Captain Janeway's choice to give Tuvok the job of training the strugglers, the four struggling crewmen. I mean, maybe in a small way, it makes more sense when you're kind of in the moment inside the captain's ready room, and you just kind of limit yourself to that world for a moment. You've got Janeway and Chakotay and Tuvok standing in their perfect, nice little triangle formation, swapping data sets and crew analyses. Within that context, Tuvok, in that wonderful, predictable, structured setting, Tuvok seems quite a bit like a reasonable choice to train some struggling crewmen. Because Tuvok's kind of a pretty ideal officer when you see him in those kind of contexts. And maybe Janeway never saw Tuvok interacting with, shall we say, psychologically complex humans. Maybe Janeway just knows Tuvok for his excellence that shows up in these extremely structured formal contexts where there aren't humans or people as the bizarre variable that confounds Tuvok, at least at this point. I'm supposing, and I haven't watched through to see if this is the case, but I'm kind of assuming this is season 1. I'm assuming that Tuvok grows in his kind of perceptiveness, because when I think of Tuvok, I think of a very psychologically perceptive character. But clearly in this episode, he hasn't built that skill, at least not with people like these people. But anyway, I can see why the captain would think this was a good choice. But definitely, as I watched it this last time, my first reaction when I saw that scene was something to the effect of, "Is Janeway really that short-sighted?" You know, I feel so bad for Tuvok because at this point, Tuvok has just had that run-in with Dalby, and clearly Tuvok knows that Tuvok doesn't have a clue what makes Dalby tick. He's quite literally the stereotypical case of clueless. But he's willing to take whatever task Janeway thinks he can handle and go and try and do his best. He's just clueless. And I suppose also Janeway's logic that she expresses here does make some sense as well. Tuvok is the one who has, what does she say, 15 years of academic teaching experience at the academy. Man, you can you can picture Tuvok being a prof at the academy, standing in front of these large bustling classrooms of students, periodically tapping on his good old LCARS PowerPoint to reveal the next outline heading as he talks through the philosophy of logic or the history of Klingon Federation relations, or maybe how to disarm a photonic warhead in 20 seconds or less. Good old Tuvok. Who wouldn't love to have him as your prof? But I guess at the end of the day, that's why Tuvok couldn't get along with the challenged crewmen, because he thought of them as academy students who could be pushed to excellence. All academy students have at least one thing in common. They have motivation to excel, or they leave and drop out, Not only have they, students like that, not only have they invested a lot up front in terms of not only the work they put in, but as well as the social expectations that are on them. But they've also got long-term goals at the academy that finding success at the academy is going to help them work toward. Those same kind of long-term goals, whether it's being a captain or whether they just want to be on a starship or whatever, they've got something that they want, this long-term goal, which is actually what motivated them to get into the academy in the first place. So if Tuvok can't get a handle on what motivates these people he's trying to work with, then it doesn't matter how hard he pushes them. He'll just end up pushing them straight through the floor, so to speak. It's kind of similar. It's really the same reason where in the real world, free educational or free counseling services tend to not work well. Because if the person being helped or the person being given the free education resources or whatever, if they don't have significant investment up front, as represented by maybe financial commitment or serious time commitments, well, without that kind of thing, the person will be far less likely to feel it necessary to push forward with the willpower-based effort to hold up his end of the equation, to do his homework, so to speak, to actually tune in to the webinar that's worth $600 and he's getting for free, that kind of thing. Similarly, in the world of music education, young students who are, let's say, they're working on pieces of music or styles of music that they don't personally enjoy, they'll be likely to put in the absolute minimum effort possible just to avoid getting backlash from their parents. They're not actually going to excel. But in contrast, if a teacher wants to have a positive teaching experience in which the student can be pushed to excellence, he'll set up his teaching environment to have both of those aspects of motivation significantly present. The beforehand investment, so students have skin in the game, whether it's through financial commitment or social commitment or costly scheduling commitment that can't be reversed, and also the afterward motivation, the goal that they're trying to work toward down the road, something related to, let's say, graduation, or related to getting a skill that they need for something they need or want, or could be an end result that the student's going to receive when they graduate, or it could even just be the intrinsic reward of the learning process itself, as would be in the case of a music student who is learning music that he actually likes, or the same kind of thing when somebody's in college or in grad school who's actually passionate about the actual subject he's studying. He wants to learn the things because of the intrinsic reward. That would be kind of a similar category. Now, as far as motivations go, in the case of these 4 crewmen, we actually get a little bit of a glimpse into their personal motivation factors when they're sitting in the mess hall. They're talking about the consequences. They're talking about what consequences are likely to play out after they walked out on Tuvok in their first session. Remember, Dalby kind of led them out, and then Chell was the last one. He finished his laps, and then he's like, "Oh, we're leaving." He kind of walked out. But when they talk about that in the mess hall, we find out, number one, they don't want to be on Voyager in the first place, and number two, they have no fear of any consequences, such as social consequences or any other kind of consequences for dropping out. Remember, they said something to the effect of, "What are they going to do to us? Throw us in the brig for the rest of the trip?" You know. And then, of course, we get Chakotay's response to the situation. He talks about the Maquis way, a good little knock to the jaw. And that made the necessary difference in their motivations. I don't think it was a punitive or a fear-based motivation. I think the result of Chakotay's fist was maybe 10% fear of punishment and 99% social consequence. Okay, so those numbers don't add up, but I think you get what I'm saying. Chakotay's response, not only did it remind Dalby of Dalby's prior social commitment to respect and follow the Maquis leadership, particularly Chakotay, but more importantly, it created a context of social consequence in which Dalby's failure to fit into this community, into this command structure, Dalby's failure to fit into that is going to result in public embarrassment within the group, rather than allowing Dalby's own narrative to reign supreme, this narrative that he shares and believes that unreasonable things are being expected of him. He's being asked to do things he never signed up for. That's his narrative. Instead, Chakotay thrusts Dalby into another narrative, which involves strong social consequence, namely the narrative that Dalby is the sore thumb sticking out in the middle of a ship that is otherwise working well. And for him to keep on being that sore thumb is for him to keep on betraying the commander that he already made prior commitments to, Chakotay. Within that context of social consequence, Dalby's sense of entitlement, his resentment for his situation, that all gives way to begrudging cooperation. Because at this point, suddenly, his social resistance is no longer a feasible option. And then it's back on Tuvok. He gets his students back, and they have at least a minimal commitment. They don't actually want to be there, but they no longer have a choice in the matter. Kind of like the music student whose parent says you must go to lessons and you must practice, or the college student who knows he has to pass his classes or else he'll end up feeling humiliated in front of his family and friends. At this point, it is, in a meaningful, real way, it is really on Tuvok, because depending what kind of experience will follow for each of these forced participants, depending what kind of experience follows for them, they might find, someone might find his forced participation, he might find that it gradually becomes more rewarding and it wasn't so bad. Or he could take a different path, depending on what happens. He could end up just becoming more resentful, more bitter. While Dalby has motivation to go through the motions of his training, he has no motivation to excel or to value the training, as demonstrated by his continual resentful attitude and by Tuvok's continued frustration. But Tuvok's best efforts at providing an appropriate kind of training seems uniformly to be about as counterproductive as could be imaginable. And to look at it just on the surface, it almost looks like much of Tuvok's MO almost seems like it's tailored specifically, intentionally, to try and drain the subject's self-efficacy. The later we find that these demoralizing methods where he sets them up to fail and then tells them that they failed, that these demoralizing methods were actually the result of Tuvok's lack of perceptiveness, his lack of familiarity with the category or with the class unmotivated student. That category for him, he's just not familiar with it. He doesn't know what it means. He doesn't know what goes on inside the heads of these people who he certainly didn't meet very often in his the kind of role he had at the academy. And I think this becomes especially clear, the fact that he's not trying to drill them into the ground. I think that becomes especially clear when you hear him discussing it with Neelix. The topic of self-efficacy is definitely, I think, an important one to this greater category, and it comes up in the episode the clearest expression of the concept of self-efficacy in the episode is Tuvok's statement to Dalby in the holodeck. This is after he decided to Tuvok decided, Neelix talked to him about plant stems that break. He says, you got to be a little more flexible. You're not dealing with the people you think you are. And Tuvok decides to get to know them. He invites them to the holodeck, and he's chatting with Dalby, or trying to chat, because Dalby's resentment is pretty deep, and he thinks Tuvok is, the biggest monster on the planet. Not necessarily blame him because of the way things worked out. But anyway, Tuvok makes the comment that Chakotay specifically, because Dalby says something to the effect of, how could you be such a jerk to poor little Garen? He shouldn't even be here. He's just a kid. And then Tuvok points out, Chakotay specifically felt that Garen needed this experience to help him build self-efficacy. I'm throwing the word in there. Tuvok didn't use the word, but to help him build self-efficacy by performing difficult tasks successfully, which is really what self-efficacy is. And that's basically what Tuvok said. Garen is kind of like, he's this kid. He can't do anything, can't succeed at anything. He needs the experience of doing difficult things and coming out the other end and saying, look at that, I did that. I can't believe I did that, So that's clearly a category here. And I think it's an important category anytime you're in the kind of coaching / counseling / teaching / when someone is in that kind of context, this is the kind of category we're working with. Self-esteem is still kind of the popular catchword, in pop psychology, but self-esteem is, it matters. You can have too much self-esteem, building somebody's self-esteem is not always the best go-to thing, but self-efficacy is something that I think we would do well to get that more into our vocabulary and get self-esteem a little bit out of our vocabulary. It matters, self-esteem matters, but self-efficacy, I think, matters a whole lot more. So this is definitely on the table, but even though I think it'd be fair to say this is a conscious goal of Tuvok, as suggested by Chakotay, even though it is a conscious goal that he has in mind, Tuvok continually fails to give any of the participants the opportunity to succeed in anything, suggesting that Tuvok isn't actually, not primarily at least, targeting self-efficacy as the goal, at least not in a conscious or focused manner, or at least certainly not in a psychologically aware manner. You could even suggest, wrongly I think, but you could even suggest that Tuvok is trying to use these methods of making them fail and telling them they failed. You could suggest he's using those methods to try to drain out the arrogance of Dalby, to quote unquote break him down and make him more of the kind of officer who will obey orders. Because if you remember in the beginning, one of his issues was that he went off and changed the gel pack by himself. So you could say, well, he's kind of an arrogant guy who does his own thing. We need to break him down. However, I think, though it does kind of look like that, and I started to think that partway through it, but it seems like he's trying to do that. But I think Tuvok's dialogue with Neelix in the mess hall, I think that kind of suggests to us that Tuvok's not trying to do that. He's actually trying to push these participants the same way he would for students at the academy, students who have the potential to reach beyond their current level of effort. If you can just trigger that, and Tuvok is continually disappointed to find that these students here, apparently they're either unable or unwilling to rise to the challenge. They just won't succeed. So then, rather than these tried and true methods, rather than when he uses these tried and true methods, instead of building self-efficacy in them by them meeting his high goals, by him setting high standards and high expectations and then reaching up to meet them, instead, they are continually drained of their self-efficacy, because their best efforts, as far as they can tell, they're giving their best efforts. They don't know how to meet his expectations. Instead, their best efforts continue to fail to meet Tuvok's expressed goals for them. And if that were to keep going without anything changing, you would end up with learned helplessness. Neelix suggests in that mess hall conversation, Neelix suggests that the problem is one of inflexibility, like a plant that breaks because too much pressure was applied. But not the inflexibility of the students, the inflexibility of the teacher. Tuvok has had plenty of experience teaching large classrooms of highly motivated and socially committed students who become stronger when more pressure is applied. But Tuvok has had, apparently, little to no experience tutoring struggling students who have minimal mental toughness, like Garen, Chell, or students who have this extreme psychological resistance and no desire to do much of anything, such as Dalby. The resolution of the episode, I suppose, occurs when Tuvok breaks his own rules, or he bends, like the flexible plant, the Neelix's plant, he bends. And he chooses to rescue, or to try to rescue, Garen in accord with Dalby's off the charts expressed values, as he's yelling at Tuvok and saying, how can you, be such a, cold-blooded Vulcan, you green-blooded, as McCoy would say. While Tuvok's decision was definitely a tactically unhelpful move in the sense that it resulted in 2 people being incapacitated instead of 1, but it was a psychologically savvy move because it communicated to Dalby that Tuvok respected Dalby's subjective values, such as his concern for Garen, because Dalby's values at this point were Dalby's one remaining motivation, his one remaining passion within his really existentially frustrated, bitter, and cynical phase of life. One of those guys who he's kind of like a dead man walking around. He's like, I don't want to be here. I don't particularly want to be alive, and nothing matters to me. But then occasionally there are things that matter to him, such as quit mistreating Garen, because I see myself in Garen and I want him to have a better life experience than I had. I want to see him move on and find meaning in life instead of this, misery that I've been experiencing. So Tuvok, by paying attention to that and bending with it, by caring about it, Tuvok demonstrated that his goal in all the stuff he's doing wasn't just to make Dalby more and more angry by giving him impossible tasks and continually telling him he was not good enough. He demonstrated that instead he actually cares about and wants to seek the well-being of the group, regardless of Dalby's inappropriate, kind of attitude that he was showing there when he was yelling at Tuvok and telling him he's wrong. Now, the conclusion of the episode's dilemma may have been a bit abrupt. This is the part where Dalby says basically, well, Tuvok, if you can risk your life for us, maybe I can give a little bit of effort. He actually said we, which I thought was interesting because he's speaking for the group, which is a bit presumptuous, except for the fact that they pretty much across the board followed him no matter what he did. So I guess he has the right to speak for them in that sense. But I forget the phrasing of what he said, but it's something to the effect of, wow, Tuvok, if you can risk your life for us in the same way, we can give a little bit of ourselves for this project. That little concluding bit of dialogue, it may have been a bit abrupt because it's like Dalby does a complete 180, but it was very effective in that it forms a really effective resolution to the dilemma, which is the episode, the dilemma of the lack of motivation in these participants. Once they have a social and relational commitment to Tuvok as their instructor, at that point, then they're much more likely, they're likely to be in a spot where Tuvok may actually be able to push them to excellence, because they may actually have reason to want to reach for that excellence themselves. Without that kind of social and relational factor, Tuvok would never be able to motivate them to pursue excellence. In a similar vein, psychologists have observed in the real world, that in grade school contexts, that the teacher-student relationship plays an absolutely tremendous role in the ability of students to excel. And in this case, in our episode, you could say the single most important missing motivation in Tuvok's students was the broken relationship caused by Tuvok's lack of emotional, relational, and psychological awareness of his students. He was just remaining inflexible by trying to use his large classroom skills, or you could say his boot camp skills, even though he wasn't in those contexts. He wasn't working with that. He was thrust into this context that really was more of a tutoring or a coaching context. But he was continuing to use his motivated, successful academy student, the skills for the motivated, successful academy students, but while he was inside a context of unmotivated, unsuccessful students, the dropouts. So we end up in a place where the instructor is trying to instruct out of a inherently broken relationship, an inherently broken teacher-student relationship characterized by Tuvok's lack of emotional, relational, and psychological awareness of his students. I guess becoming flexible for Tuvok, kind of like Neelix's good plant stems that were flexible, I suppose that for Tuvok, becoming flexible meant becoming aware of his students as individuals and getting to know them, building rapport instead of remaining aloof, recognizing and respecting the values and motivations of his students, and working toward building self-efficacy in them and success in them, rather than requiring them to manage their own ratio of success to failure in contexts where in some cases, it may actually have been impossible for them to succeed, which is basically a recipe for training them into learned helplessness, which usually a lot of people would describe as a form of abuse, but we're not going to call Tuvok an abuser because we know what his goals are, and we know what ends up happening when Tuvok gets a little bit of that psychological awareness. One of the things that makes this episode so fun to watch is that it is so fundamentally human. And also, it reveals weaknesses and quirkiness in the characters that we have come to know and love so well. Tuvok usually has no pronounced flaws or weaknesses. In this episode, it's a little bit more like he has no strengths. But with all the fun relational give and take going on through the episode, there's not even a single great villain or a deadly outer space dilemma, life or death kind of thing that Voyager crew faces for the whole episode. In fact, the only great alien villain in the episode is a bacteria that infects the ship's gel packs. And the episode sports one of the most epic one-liners in all of Star Trek, when B'Elanna says with a straight face, "Get the cheese to sickbay." Gotta love it. So whatever anybody else says, I absolutely love Learning Curve. It even reminds me a little bit of the very memorable 6th season episode Good Shepherd, with the unique emphasis on exploring the psychology of individual. I'm talking about Good Shepherd more than Learning Curve, but it's kind of true about both. But in Good Shepherd, they really explore the psychology of individual unfamous crew members, and they put them into psychologically difficult circumstances for us to observe them and really take note of them as humans. And of course, the episode also certainly takes a bit of a cue from the Next Generation 7th season episode Lower Decks. Maybe Learning Curve will never make it onto any top 10 Voyager episodes lists. I don't think it's probably on any of those, but it doesn't have to. It makes for a great, reflective, and pleasant watching experience when you want to just go visit your Star Trek friends without having to deal with Borg or Kazon putting everybody in danger. You just want to enjoy some people dilemmas on Voyager. And it's got Chell, who I mostly remember for the bit of wisdom that he shared in the PC game Elite Force, when he said, "If you see a light at the end of a wormhole, it's probably a photon torpedo." And incidentally, in Elite Force, Chell became a valued and skilled member of their special team, kind of suggesting at least the way those video game developers see the story, they're kind of suggesting that Chell finally got the drive for excellence that Tuvok was trying to push him toward. That Chell finally built enough self-efficacy, motivation, and social commitment to make the leap and become successful. I think that's a pretty cool idea. Anyway, so that's just a little bit of my thoughts on learning curve. It's a fun little episode, and I think it's also a unique and fun opportunity to think about the psychology of some of these characters and to see Tuvok learning and see Tuvok, who sometimes looks flawless, see him in his clueless state. So I had a lot of fun watching it. Anyway, that's it for this video. Catch you around.